Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. I'm in your old stomping grounds at CERN. How are you doing?
Ah, thank you so much for joining so late. I know it's almost 10, right?
It's worth staying up for. Very happy to be here. Thanks for doing a physics club.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. Can you hear me all right?
Very well. Yeah.
And may
And I
I
think,
interrupt quickly just to say thank you for accepting our application, our invitation to come and give the physics club. And thank you, Sarah, for recommending this. It was really wonderful. So, yeah.
and I see that you're already recording, Keith. You have us all set up.
Okay, I don't have authority over that. Whoever set this up, I can't stop the recording. So anyway.
All right.
That is a good point, though. I need to figure out a way to stop the recording.
I think it's probably fine. None of us here are host, though. Is someone going to join with hosting power so that we can mute if needed? Not Yangyang, but others.
I have asked if I can have hosting authority, and they always tell me, everybody I talk to, Keith, you have it now, just use it. And I don't. When I try to change it, it says, please ask the host to give you permission to record. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
You logged in, Professor Baker?
Say it again.
Are you logged into Zoom right now?
Yes.
All right. It's just, I remember when I was TAing on Zoom, that was a common reason for the problem.
So what's the solution?
If you press participants and press the claim host button, it'll pop up something that has you log into your Zoom account.
Okay.
Yeah, one problem is that there are so many Zoom accounts. I think I have 3 Zoom accounts. It's hard to keep track of which one you're logging into what context for, huh?
Hi, Karsten. Nice to meet you virtually.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks so much for coming and giving the physics club today.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure.
Karsten, do you have authority to end the recording while we chit chat before the talk?
Let me just see if I can do this.
All right, excellent. Welcome everyone to the Physics Club from the Yale Physics Department, co-hosted this time, actually co-sponsored by the Paul Tsai China Center at the Yale Law School. So this is an exciting joint event for us. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Yangyang before she gives her presentation. I will start with the physics side of her background, which is more familiar to those of us on that side of the equation. She got her bachelor's degree in 2009 from the University of Science and Technology of China. 2015, she got her PhD from the University of Chicago on the Atlas experiment. And she was one of the first who did a dark matter search for dark matter produced in association with Higgs bosons. Which is an exciting way that we're pivoting to using the discovery of the Higgs to then go hunting for physics beyond the standard model. After her PhD on the Atlas experiment, she joined the CMS experiment, also at the Large Hadron Collider, where she was a postdoc with Cornell, and then served as a distinguished research fellow at Fermilab in the LHC Physics Center. She's worked on a lot of, in addition to her pioneering searches for dark matter and displaced particles, she's worked on designing pixel detectors for the upgrade of the high luminosity LHC, hadronic calorimeters, and also track triggers for future high intensity, high occupancy hadron colliders. So all of that is on her physics side of things. Throughout this work in the physics regime, she has also been doing a tremendous amount beyond that has gotten the attention not only of those in the physics community, but far beyond. And I see her as one of the most brilliant and insightful writers we have today. And I'm going to, given that I started close to on time, give a very brief advertisement for this writing because I have your attention. And then I'll hand it over to her for her to give us her presentation. So she has written in a huge variety of different, I don't know if venues is the right word, publications, Yangyang, including the LA Review of Books, where she reminded us that the official story is never the only story, which is very wise. In the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, she reminded us that pretending to be above and beyond politics is by itself a political position. In adopting it, one has aligned with the state and sided with the powerful. In The Guardian, she reminded us that language is more than a medium for communication. It's an instrument of power, a measure of humanity, a map for world making. And finally, in the New York Times, I'm a scientist and a writer. It's the responsibility of my vocations to ask the questions obscured by simplified answers. So I don't expect we're going to get simplified answers this afternoon. She's going to talk to us about old divisions and new realms, if I can read my handwriting, physics across borders. So thanks so much, Yangyang, for joining us. I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this overly kind and generous introduction. So it's my honor to be a part of the physics club as part of this distinguished tradition. So I will share my screen now, if you could see it. And this is a story that I will start from this campus 170 years ago, when Yunwen was the first Chinese person to graduate from an American university when he graduated from Yale in 1854. He went back to China after graduation, at the time the Qing Empire, and it was an interesting time for Yun's homeland and then also my homeland, where the former mighty Manchu Empire was in crumbles. It was facing foreign invasions and internal turmoil. And there were reform-minded officials in the Qing Empire who started the self-strengthening movement, whose unofficial motto is best known by this line from the Qing scholar Wei Yuan, 师夷长技以制夷, which is learn advanced technology from the barbarians to keep barbarian invaders at bay. So there was this consciousness to learn foreign, mostly Western modern science and technology. On the other hand, there was also this centuries-old sense of cultural superiority that was shaken but not yet shattered. And after the Birmingham Treaty of 1868 between the Qing Empire and the United States, that was mostly about trade and immigration, but also included the clause that allowed basically Americans and also subjects of the Qing Empire to go to each other's country and attend each other's schools. So starting in 1872, Yun started managing this program called the Chinese Educational Mission that was sponsored and supervised by the Qing government. And it was the first government-sponsored foreign educational program from China. And over the course of 9 years, there were a total of 120 Chinese boys aged about 10 to 16 who came to the US to go to secondary schools and high schools. And the idea was that they would complete undergraduate education in the US and go back to China, or at the time, the Qing Empire. And because of the focus of the program, the Chinese students were encouraged to learn science and engineering because they were supposed to devote to the industrialization and military self-strengthening of their homeland. However, the program had a lot of promise, but it also faced a lot of obstacles. Inside the Qing government, there were conservative forces who doubted this kind of westernization. And some of the boys, when they returned to China, were questioned for their loyalty to the emperor. On the other hand, in the US, the situation was also complicated. There was like rising anti-Chinese racism. And so the program was abruptly stopped in 1881, and all the boys were recalled to China. and most of them did return. There were only 2 boys who did complete their education, undergraduate education in the US, both from Yale. One of them, as seen on the bottom left, is Zhan Tianyou, who studied at what was then the Sheffield Scientific School at Yale College, and he went back and studied civil engineering. He went back to China and is known as the father of Chinese railroads. And there were another student who was also an alumni of the Chinese educational mission, was a man by the name of Liang Cheng. And later in the early 20th century, early 1900s, he served as the Qing ambassador to the US. And this was a time when no amount of self-strengthening could save this crumbling empire. And Qing was overthrown in 1911, and the Republic of China was born. But through this time, Ambassador Liang Chen, he studied at Andover in the US, played on the baseball team, and was able to bond with President Theodore Roosevelt over their mutual love for this sport. And part of his own lobbying, partly of the US side, ideas about how to improve US-China relations and how to educate the backwards Chinese people, who how to help civilize this backwards nation. And so the US government decided in a few years after the Boxer Protocol was signed in 1901 to return part of the indemnity. And taking some inspiration from the Chinese educational mission, the US side dictated the terms that the money should be used for education. And so most of it went to establishing the Tsinghua College, which is later the Tsinghua University, one of the premier technological universities in China today. And the rest went to establishing the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship. I should also take note here that the first president of Tsinghua College was also an alum of the Chinese educational mission and spent 1 year at Yale College before being recalled to China, Tang Guan. And the motto of Tsinghua was, taking a note from the term self-strengthening and from the ancient book of I Ching, was, the work of self-strengthening is ceaseless, the virtuous carry the world with generosity. And so in the first half of the 20th century, partly with the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship and other forms of government-sponsored scholarships, there was a small cohort of Chinese intellectuals, mostly almost all men, who received education in the US and some in Europe. And many of them returned to China and helped lay the foundation for modern science and education in this war-torn nation. And in 1945, there was one gentleman who graduated from Tsinghua and received a Boxer Indemnity Scholarship and came to pursue his PhD in physics at the University of Chicago. And this is the gentleman on the left here, Chen Yangyang, whom we are all very familiar with. And I should, as Sarah mentioned, I'm an alum of the University of Chicago. So I should say that when Chen Yangyang started at University of Chicago, before switching his focus to theoretical physics, he worked briefly at the laboratory of Samuel K. Allison. And on the academic family tree, Allison would be my great-grand advisor. However, Yang, according to himself, was not a very good experimentalist, and his colleagues even made up this joke, where there is Ban, there is Yang. However, frustrations in the lab were the minor side of Yang's troubles. As we know that back in the 1940s, there was when Yang and his classmates came to study in the US, they came as citizens of the Republic of China, which is a major ally of the US in World War II. However, while they were pursuing their degrees in the West, the Civil War was waging in China, and they faced. And soon the government changed hands and they became suspect because of their Chinese affiliations, as the newly founded People's Republic of China became an adversary of the US in the new Cold War. And so Yang and his classmates, they could, if they stay in the US, they would face racism and anti-communist paranoia and different kinds of hostilities. If they go back to China, they would face a war-tattered nation, extreme poverty, and also extreme political uncertainty with this new communist government. And there was also the nationalist government that retreated to Taiwan. And so in that time, Yang and his colleagues made very different decisions that would impact their entire lives. Yang decided to stay in the US, and as we know, he was one of the first 2 Chinese Nobel laureates for their theory of proving that the universe's symmetry is broken for a parity violation. And Yang's best friend since adolescence, Deng Jiaxian, who received his PhD in physics from Purdue University, went back to China 9 days after graduation and was the leader in the Chinese nuclear weapons program. And this is Yang's younger brother, Chen Yang, who later also had a distinguished career in physics at Ohio State University. On the other hand, Yang and Deng's former professor in China, Wu Taiyou, who received his PhD from University of Michigan back in the 1930s and went back to China to teach. He later followed the nationalist government to Taiwan and was a major figure in establishing the post-war science and education in Taiwan. And in Wu Taiyou's memoir, he noted how in the entire first half of the 20th century, there was only a total of 162 people in the entirety of China who have PhDs in physics. And this is tabulated by time. So the talent is extremely needed in their homeland. On the other hand, the political situation was also extremely precarious. One thing to note was that relatively few overseas Chinese scientists followed the nationalist government to Taiwan. On one hand, the nationalist government at the time was also a brutal military dictatorship, so it was not as if it was a particularly appealing choice. On the other hand, I think this is also a note of how for the overseas Chinese scientists, if they chose to return to their homeland, their allegiance was with the land of their birth and its people. It was not necessarily with the ruling government, but in order to fulfill this sense of service, they were willing to work with the governments that ruled the country. And then quickly in the early 1950s, as the Korean War broke out, the US government placed a ban basically on overseas Chinese scientists in the country with science or engineering backgrounds. And the repatriation of Chinese nationals was a major point of discussion in 1955 during the ambassadorial talks in Geneva between US and the People's Republic of China, when the 2 countries did not have formal diplomatic ties yet. And so for the next few decades, it was not just physical distances, but geopolitical borders that seemed impenetrable at times that separated former families, friends, and colleagues for the next few decades. And then coming to 1971 with Kissinger's visit earlier that year, our old friend Yangyang, I think this was a rather remarkable thing that he did. He was the first Chinese American scientist to visit the People's Republic in the summer of 1971. And at the time, he was already a naturalized US citizen. And because the 2 countries didn't have formal diplomatic ties, he received his visa to China through the French embassy and through the Chinese embassy in Paris. And he visited China more regularly in the next few years and met with top leadership. He met with Chou Enlai during his first visit. He met with Mao Zedong in 1973. And starting with Yang in 1971, Chinese American scientists visited the country of their birth in relatively significant numbers, considering the geopolitical conditions of the time. They met with colleagues, learned what they're doing, met with top leadership, advocated for basic research. Notably, in 1972, there was a delegation of Chinese American scientists who visited China and met with Chinese leadership, and the trip was reported on the front page of the People's Daily, which is the official newspaper for the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think this is an interesting historical moment to reflect on. I know that I used this photo for the poster of this talk, and I find this to be an extremely morally ambiguous moment. On one hand, we need to acknowledge that these scientists are all people, and a very basic incentive for them to visit their homeland was that they actually have not been able to go back or see their family and friends for decades. And also as scientists, they were also curious about the science and education in China and were conducting some academic discussions. And their trips were indeed very helpful to improve some of the conditions in science and education in China at the time. And some of the top leaders, including Mao, did take into heart some of the advocacies for basic research. But this was also the time of the Cultural Revolution, with purges and persecutions of intellectuals. And the Chinese, predominantly Chinese American scientists, when visiting the land of their birth, also became part of Chinese state propaganda. Another thing is, back in the US, their trips also drew attention from the FBI. Notably for this delegation of Chinese American scientists in 1972, it was led by the Johns Hopkins University physicist Zhen, and he was subject to many years of surveillance from the FBI as part of the FBI's secret program, surveilling Chinese scientists of Chinese ethnicity in the US. That started sometime in the 1960s and lasted till at least 1978 and probably later. And there is a really nice report of this by investigative journalist Mara Hofstendahl in The Intercept that I encourage everyone to read. And so, on the other hand, back in the US, a lot of Chinese Americans, many of them scientists, also organized politically and advocated for the US government to normalize relations with the People's Republic. For example, the National Association of Chinese Americans, after it was founded, and Yang served as its first president, and they ran this full-page ad in newspapers asking the Carter administration in '79 to normalize bilateral relations. On the other hand, through the 1970s, while formal relations were not yet established, there were dozens of Chinese scientist delegations accounting for hundreds of scientists who visited the US briefly, including in 1975 when the delegation met with President Ford in the White House. And this gentleman here in glasses is Zhou Peiyuan, who was also an alum of Tsinghua and the recipient of the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship, who later received his education at the University of Chicago and Caltech before returning to China. And he was later a major figure in using science as a bridge in China's foreign relations through the much of the later half of the 20th century. And so, in 1979, the two countries finally established the diplomatic relations. And on January 31st, when Carter and Dunn started signing all these agreements, the very first agreement they signed was the US-China Agreement on Incorporation of Science and Technology. And this is the first agreement between these two states, and it's still in effect. We'll come back to this agreement in a little bit. And also, after decades of isolation, Chinese students could finally go to the West for study. And in 1978, Deng Xiaoping famously told Carter's science advisor that we should send tens of thousands of students overseas, not just 8 or 10. And according to Deng, this was a way to lift the nation within a short amount of time, within, like, say, 5 years. But of course, this was in China at the time, it was just emerging out of all the political disasters of the Mao era. And formal education was basically halted for an entire decade during the Cultural Revolution. There was no standardized tests like the GRE or the TOEFL for Chinese students to take. And so there was very few pathways for Chinese students to be admitted to graduate programs in the US. And Chen Daoli or Li Zhendao, TD Li, Yang's co-laureate in the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1956, and he did a pioneering work, which was founding the program shortened as CUSPIA, which is the China-US Physics Examination and Application Program. And during the decade of its running, this program provided one of the first and one of the few pathways for Chinese students at the time to go to the US for study. And so here is a photo from my undergraduate alma mater, as Sarah mentioned, USDC in 1982. In the middle is Xiaogang Wen, now at MIT, that many of us would know that he was the national first place recipient in CUSPIA at the time, and was later able to have a distinguished career in physics in the US. And here, this is in the 90s when standardized tests and these transcripts became more standardized in China, and the CUSPIA has lived out its purpose. But there were also other events to look back at the program and its foundational importance. For example, here, this is TD Li, and this woman here is the only women first place winner in CUSPIA, and she won for national first place in 1984. And then this Li Zhaoling, who is now a prominent biophysicist, a neuroscientist in Germany. And in 1993, T.D. Lee also did this drawing looking back at his program, and the Chinese inscription here reads, "Tens of thousands of branches are all connected. The entire forest started from a tree." And my undergraduate alma mater, USTC, among like the 915 students who were able to come to the US to study for physics PhD programs through Caspia, USTC alums were about a quarter of them. And when I was studying at USTC, there about a third of science and engineering majors would choose to go to go abroad, predominantly the US, for graduate school. And so USTC earned this nickname called United States Training Center. So coming back to the perspective of the Chinese government, for example, earlier when Deng Xiaoping initiated or gave the permission for Chinese students to go abroad to study, the idea was not, the motivation was not personal freedom or academic freedom. The motivation was very much state-centric, that they could come back to rebuild the nation. But then the Chinese government also has to contend with human nature, that most people just prefer a higher standard of living and more opportunities for research. And so for many years, the majority of Chinese students who studied abroad stayed abroad. I think this chart is indicative here that really we have to look at the timeline before this sharp tick in the mid-2000s, because afterwards, this sharp drive of the number of Chinese students who go abroad in blue and the number who return in orange, the sharp rise after 2008 or so are mainly driven by undergraduate students or students who studied for a short master's program and go to work in industry. And so we could see that for many years before, like it was only about 20% of Chinese students who went abroad would go back to China. And since the late 2000s, with the economic rise of China and the government's investment in science and technology, the Chinese government has initiated a variety of overseas talent recruitment programs with a focus on science, engineering, and entrepreneurship. The most well-known, of course, is the 1,000 Talent program, but the 1,000 Talent is supported by the central government. There are also lots of, up to the schools or even hundreds, some supported by the local government. For example, like the city of Shenzhen's Peacock Plan. One of the Peacock Plans recruits probably more notoriety is He Jiankui, who is also an alum of USTC, a physics graduate from Rice University and a postdoc at Stanford, who later went back to China and was the one who did the world's first gene-edited babies experiment back in 2018. And so here, this is a screenshot I took from the 1,000 Talents website, where the main website there was in English, and its applicants are not exclusive to people of Chinese ethnicity, but its promotional materials very clearly appeal to sentiments of national belonging, calling on the Chinese diaspora to come home. For example, here in red, the Chinese script reads, "The motherland needs you, the motherland welcomes you, the motherland places her hope in you." And this, I took this screenshot a couple of years ago, because up until like sometime mid last year in 2020, the 1,000 Talents website is no longer accessible. As we know, the overseas talent recruitment programs has become one of the most contentious points in US-China relations. And the 1,000 Talent program is also caricatured as a conduit for intellectual property theft. And I should acknowledge here that there are indeed cases of ethical violations in some of these program recipients. A lot of these violations are violations of academic discipline, that because of negligence, misunderstanding of the rules, or at times because of vanity or greed or certain moral lapses. There were individuals who may have didn't properly disclose their source of funding or forms of collaborations. They may have violated some of the time requirements in taking multiple ostensibly full-time positions in different countries, and who may have even in more serious cases violated a confidentiality in grant proposals or during peer review. And there are also cases for example, like He Jiankui I mentioned, and who is not a case of in the sense of criminal in the US sense, but did an extremely unethical experiment. And these are things that should that academia has a responsibility to pay attention to. And it is also true that until very recently, US universities, partly out of a sense to a belief in the cosmopolitan ideals of science, partly out of lack of knowledge of the nature of the Chinese society and Chinese political system, didn't think through a lot of the social and political implications of these collaborations, and have overall encouraged these types of collaborations. And until the political wings have turned. And so many of us here in this conversation know in 2018, when the Justice Department at the time under Attorney General Jeff Sessions started the China Initiative, that is as a way to crack down on economic espionage from China, with a particular focus on academia. And then I think there has been a lot of calls for the Biden administration to end the China Initiative, though that has not realized yet. But I also think it is important, as this conversation has gone on, to take a historical perspective in this, that suspicion of Chinese scientists in the US was really not new. It started basically as soon as there are significant numbers of Chinese scientists in the US, and as China became a geopolitical adversary of the US since the 1950s. And it flared up again in the 1990s. And has intensified even before the 2018 China Initiative during the Obama administration as well. And so the Committee of 100, which is a civic organization of Chinese Americans, has released a new report that did an empirical study of the cases of economic espionage since 1996. That was when the law was first passed. And we could see here that starting in the Obama administration, the majority of defendants in the case were of Chinese ethnicity. And this by itself probably doesn't mean as much, because it could also be that a lot of people of Chinese ethnicity were indeed doing unscrupulous things, as the FBI or the Justice Department often says that 80% of economic espionage act cases benefit the Chinese state. However, I think what is more significant is the study of the results of the cases themselves, that according to the Committee of 100 report, people of Chinese ethnicity are more likely to be charged and have their cases publicized, more likely to be innocent of more serious offenses, as this graph shows, that people of Chinese ethnicity or Asian ethnicity in general are about twice as likely to be innocent of the most serious offenses. Again, they were charged under the Economic Espionage Act, but they were not found guilty of fraud or espionage, but were convicted of procedural offenses only, or were just innocent, and are more likely to be denied bail and more likely to receive longer sentences. So there is a rather compelling empirical evidence that there is indeed racial bias in a lot of these economic espionage cases. And here, from this study, it also noted that although, for example, the China Initiative has a focus on academia, and we've noted a lot of cases of US-based scientists, many of Chinese ethnicity, who are being investigated or even charged or indicted, but only about 3% of Economic Espionage Act cases concern academia. So the focus on academia is on one hand rather misplaced. On the other hand, we also know that a lot of these recent cases of under the China Initiative, the scientists in the US were not charged under espionage, but were charged of procedural violations of non-disclosure in grant proposals, etc., but were given really serious charges like wire fraud or tax fraud or lying to federal authorities. And with this, I would like to comment quickly on the whole idea of whether or not it's not just whether or not there were people with affiliations with the Chinese state that are trying to steal knowledge, as we are hearing a lot in the dominant political rhetoric. Something needs to be owned to be stolen. So I think the more serious question here is not necessarily what, it's not just what laws are in the books and whether or not they're being violated. But more seriously, the question is who owns knowledge and whether or not it should be proprietary. And when we think about research on university campuses, and here I'm not talking about industrial research, that is a whole other area. The first question we ask is it classified? And again, the concerns over technology transfer to geopolitical adversaries is again not new. Back in 1983, concerns about technological transfer to the Eastern Bloc, to the Soviet Union, and the Reagan administration convened a study that resulted in 2 years later in this National Security Decision Directive 189 that is still in effect, which basically says that the product of fundamental research should, to the maximum extent possible, remain unrestricted. And when national security requires control, the mechanism is classification. And classified research, this is another discussion that we can have later, which is classified research on campus is in general quite controversial for reasons of ethics and academic freedom, but its size has grown, especially since 9/11. But on the other hand, most of these cases that when we are discussing with regards to China Initiative or with regards to this IP, economic espionage, or all other forms of highly publicized cases of Chinese American scientists in this country being charged, they were not involved in any kind of classified research. However, there is another layer to this, is whether or not this kind of research is proprietary, and publicly funded research on university campuses becoming proprietary is also a relatively recent thing, and it's coming with a trend of commercialization and privatization of higher education that to a large extent started with the Bayh-Dole Act of Senators Birch Bayh and Bob Dole in 1980 that allows and indeed encourages universities to patent research products from federally funded research and license them for profit. While before the act, most of these research products from publicly funded research remained in the public domain. And alongside this commercialization and privatization of university research, other trends also include the criminalization of IP infringement. As mentioned, the Economic Espionage Act is not that old. It only started in 1996 under the Clinton administration that for the first time made trade secret theft a federal crime. And also alongside that, the United States has also used its geopolitical leverage and economic leverage to impose transnational standards of intellectual property protection, including most notably the TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights regime. That this has been in the news a lot because of the COVID vaccine related distribution and equity concerns. So I think a more important question that we need to reflect on is what do intellectual properties actually protect, and what this legal regime has developed to this to today is that a lot of the protection are not to protect innovation or protect public interest. It's a lot of times to protect corporate interests and the geopolitical interests of a state. And if we actually look at the cases of history, when the United States was a developing country itself, newly independent from Great Britain, it also violated a lot of export control and immigration laws from Europe in order to acquire advanced technologies of its time. And if we look at the history of intellectual property development in different countries, a lot of that is tied with the country's legal tradition and cultural tradition. But another probably most important factor, it is tied with the country's stage of economic development. And as China experiences its economic rise in the past few years, it has also strengthened its IP protection, but with a focus on protecting its domestic industries. And so here, coming back to earlier, I mentioned in 1979, the very first agreement signed between the People's Republic of China and the US was this agreement on cooperation in science and technology. And this agreement was initially for 5 years and has been rather consistently renewed. It lapsed once after the Tiananmen crackdowns of 1989. And I think this is an issue that we can reflect on or discuss later in Q&A, that after the Tiananmen crackdowns, the academic community, a lot of physicists in the US reckoned with the question of the moralities of continuing scientific collaborations or any form of collaborations with Chinese counterparts. And academia in the US was very fractured at the time, with some like Chen and T.D. Lee advocating for continued cooperation, but there were also calls for different forms of boycotts. And that agreement was also lapsed for a couple of years in the immediate aftermath of Tiananmen, and it was renewed in 1991 with an added clauses for intellectual property protection, which is also reflective of the overall trend, as we discussed just now, in terms of the US government's attitudes towards intellectual property. Through that time. And then under the Trump administration, this agreement again had experienced a rocky period of time in 2017 and 2018. As mentioned, it's usually for 5 years when each time it's renewed. It was renewed for 6 months and 4 months in 2017 to 2018, and then was finally renewed again for 5 years in the fall of 2018. So it remains in effect today, but then with additionally added amendments to strengthen IP protection. And so with that, I think what is more important here, as I mentioned, is when we think about intellectual property and different kinds of information, who owns knowledge, the more important question is really to think whether or not it is a good thing to for a state to claim ownership, to draw a line around a piece of knowledge and claim it as its own. However, this seems to be the direction that both the Chinese and US governments are going in terms of using very techno-nationalistic language in science and technology policies, and in terms of using different tools of the government to assert a border in science and technology, in the flow of science and technology and knowledge. And for example, while export controls have traditionally been focused on curbing weapons proliferation and human rights abuses, in 2018 with the Export Control Reform Act, there is this new protection or new restrictions being placed on technology transfer, and which also restricts foreign investment to preserve US advantage in a lot of these so-called quote-unquote emerging and foundational technologies. And the Commerce Department identified these 14 areas of emerging and foundational technologies, a lot of them related with branches of physics, including quantum information and sensing technology. And here, this is a group photo from USDC, notably from Professor Pan Jianwei's group. That is one of the one of the world's leading groups in quantum computing and quantum secured communications. And when the group won the Newcomb Cleveland Award from AAAS in 2019 over their breakthrough experiment in quantum secured communications, Professor Pan was not able to come to the US for the award ceremony because he didn't get a visa. And I think with this group photo, I should also take note that the extreme gender disparity at my undergraduate alma mater, owing in physics in China in general, has not really improved very much over the decades. And I should also congratulate the physics department here that I know that this a new class of PhD students has more women than men for the first time, and also a significant number of underrepresented minorities. And so with that, segue, I should also point out a new survey from APS this fall that many of you may already be aware of, that surveyed over 3,000 physicists in the US at different stages of their career, and found overwhelmingly negative feedback with regards to US government's current approach to research security, where almost close to 1 in 5 of the respondents said that they've discontinued some form of international collaboration due to the new scrutinies on research security, and over 40% of international physicists in the US among the respondents to the survey said that the new approach is making them reconsider their careers in the US and find the US unwelcoming. And so relative conclusion to this talk that's come back to what is the end of this. What do the US government want? What do the Chinese government want? And what kind of world do we want to live in? And so days before taking office, President-elect Biden sent his science advisor, Eric Lander of the Broad Institute, 5 questions. And I should, since mentioning the Broad Institute, I should also take note here that over the past few years, the Broad Institute, co-managed by Harvard and MIT, was embroiled in this multi-year bitter intellectual property lawsuit with University of California, Berkeley, over rights to CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology. So this is another example of how intellectual, some of the intellectual property protections and the commercialization of research products actually do harm to academic freedom and to the advancement of knowledge, as well as to a lot of the ethical considerations. But coming back to Biden's letter, it was paying homage to FDR, whom in 1944, in the fall of 1944, as the end of World War II drew near, sent his science advisor, Vannevar Bush, 4 questions about what role the federal government could play in science and education in the days of peace ahead. And Bush responded the following year in July of 1945 with this landmark report named Science, the Endless Frontier, that emphasized the importance of basic research, which is defined as this curiosity-driven research with no goal of practical use in mind, but on the other hand, could also yield practical benefits. And Bush advocated, Bush called basic research the purest realm of science and advocated for strong federal support. And the report was instrumental to the establishment of the National Science Foundation in 1950. Also notably, Bush also put in the report recommending declassifying wartime science. As noted, this was at the end of World War II, when the federal, a lot of the scientific research at the time conducted in the US, understandably, was for the war effort, were classified. And then Bush himself, he was the founder of the defense giant Raytheon, who's former dean of the engineering school at MIT, and also headed the wartime research office in the Roosevelt administration, was certainly not a pacifist, and he was not giving this a recommendation based on any moralistic positions, but it was a very pragmatic one, that he felt the broad dissemination of knowledge is the best way to advance science, and whatever the United States scientists have been able to learn in classified research, and then the US's adversaries would be able to learn it by to find out by themselves sooner or later anyway. So this kind of classification really doesn't do any good in the long run. And I think here it is interesting that the bill, the report is called The Endless Frontier. And as our colleague, our Yale colleague in the history department, Professor Grant Grandin, wrote in his Pulitzer Prize winning book, The End of the Myth, how the frontier has taken this important position in American imagination. And it's also a way for the nation to preserve its sense of innocence and the sense of boundless promise. However, this kind of idea is also, it is a myth, and it shows certain blind spots to the history of imperial and colonial conquest in this nation, and in the context of science, as Bush was describing, saying science holds this largely unexplored hinterlands, also shows a certain blind spot to the social costs of scientific research. And I think a dark undertone to this report, Science, the Endless Frontier, is notably 2 weeks after it was submitted, the United States dropped nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so coming back to the present day in the Biden administration, so days before taking office, Biden's 5 questions to Eric Lander, his science advisor, started with global issues, pandemic response, and addressing climate change, before taking a very sharp nationalistic turn and asking how the US could ensure its global leadership, especially in competition with China. And notably this summer, US Senate passed the US Innovation and Competition Act, which is better known as the Endless Frontier Act. And in the words of Chuck Schumer, it's a once-in-a-generation investment in American science and American technology. And there's some chart analyzing the amount of federal funding for the NSF and some other grant giving agencies, and one should ask the question is what does it mean? What is American science and American technology? And the bill also includes different types of provisions and amendments to counter Chinese state influence and ambitions, and also more scrutiny on international collaborations and more detailed disclosure requirements. And then I think here it is the question is transparency is good on one hand. On the other hand, what types of transparency and these disclosure requirements should be within the academic community's self-regulation, and what should be giving the power to the state, which may be used for other types of state interests that run counter to academic ideas of academic freedom and international collaborations in science. So I think I would conclude this talk leaving with this question is what happens when science is incentivized by national rivalry, when we are seeing the rhetorics in both Beijing and Washington mimicking each other in saying science is a tool of national greatness and scientific advancements and scientists themselves as assets in great power competition. And I will tie back to the beginning of this talk that we started this conversation in the mid-19th century, in 170 years ago. And over this period of time, of course, the United States went through civil war and reconstruction. The sovereign government of China changed hands several times. The maps of the world were constantly redrawn. And as we're having this conversation here at one of the oldest educational institutions on this continent that predates the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, we also need to ask ourselves this question is what is the commitment as scientists, as intellectuals, as academics, and the academia and the academy at its best has always transcended the state and challenged the state. When we think about the university outlives kings and popes, empires and dictators, and scientists, as we extend the frontiers of human understandings of nature, we also have a moral obligation to imagine a world where no one is in exile. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Brilliant as always, insightful, challenging. Yes, I'm sorry that we're not here all to clap in person. I also have to say, Yangyang, I don't think I even gave your current title as a fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School. I apologize for that, but now I have finished your introduction.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. See, we do have a question from Kimmy. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for your great talk. Let me just lower my hand so I'm not, okay. Yeah, so I'm curious what you think about how we're going to be able to collaborate going forward, or think about who owns different technologies in relation to the climate crisis, because a lot of, the context and history of what's been going on is kind of like this competition that, whether it's related to war or advancing technology for information, is a war against different countries. But with the climate crisis, we're kind of all in a war against the same thing, kind of in a really similar way to the pandemic. And I'm just curious what your perspective is on.
We lost you, Kimmy, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm curious what your perspective is on withholding information that can actually benefit the whole world, like in a very short period of time, in terms of climate crisis.
Thank you so much for this great question, and it's a very difficult one. I'll answer it first of all in more close relations with the subject of this talk from two aspects. First is with regards to intellectual property protection. The second with regards to immigration, and then I'll come to more on the higher level or principled parts of it. And the first is like if we think about intellectual property protection, that the current IP regime very much is contrary to effectively addressing climate change, when a lot of these technologies have different forms of proprietary enforcement, and it's barring other developing countries from being able to access them. And as I also mentioned, intellectual property protection the strength of it, a lot of that is tied with the country's stage of economic development. It is not because some people, or like some cultures are somehow like predestined to disregard intellectual property. That is just like a rather racist notion. And so in this context, I think it's not just about world leaders paying lip service at whatever climate summits. It's really being able to examine the current laws and the regulations. Whose interest do they actually protect? And I think here a lot of the language is so murky that a national interest is being used, like saying, oh, protecting American interest or protecting Chinese interests, when a lot of times it's actually meant American state interest or Chinese state interest or particular corporate interest that is not only not the same as public interest, but actually contrary to public interest. And the second thing I think, okay, so I'll try to say this quickly, tying with immigration and migration is that with climate change, one of the most urgent issues is also the massive flows of people, because the climate apocalypse has already begun, and so a lot of countries are, especially the wealthiest countries, the response to that is to reassert the border as in the physical militarized border, and that also reflects a certain idea is seeing bodies, seeing people on the other side of this line as less valuable, and having this sense of dichotomy of us versus them. So I think this comes back to address climate change. The most fundamental question I would quote from the philosopher Judith Butler, of her idea of what makes a life grievable, what makes a life a life, what makes a loss a loss. And it's only that when we see all lives on this planet, all human lives on this planet as equally grievable, that it's that we would be able to have that capacious egalitarian understanding of humanity, and then to be able to address these global challenges.
Thanks. Meg.
Thank you so much for that talk. Very interesting and thought-provoking. I wanted to ask about your last point about the issue of nationalism in science strategy. Have not scientists contributed largely to this by saying, you know, we need to build the superconducting super collider because we have to be better than Europe, or I have to have my telescope because it has to be bigger than your telescope. And then even beyond that, there's also the culture of science, particularly of physics, which is very combative and very competitive. And in these days when we could be working on, you know, the most far-reaching experiments as a global community, I mean, I think we don't have the culture for it. But I'd really be interested in your point of view on this.
Oh, thank you so much, and it's great to meet you again, albeit virtually. And so I would answer this question first, like from from personal experience. And I know, like in my career in particle physics, I know like Sarah has been we have been going to like DC every spring during budget season to meet with members of Congress and their staffers. And I know the other branches of physics and other disciplines also have similar traditions, and to ask for more federal support for basic research and also for our discipline in particular. And I think it is interesting because we do have a rather scripted ask, and I also know that we would also, because we are meeting with elected officials or their staffers, that we would appeal to their sentiments of a national pride and patriotism and other forms of a US leadership and such. But I would also reckon that I don't necessarily think that it's not saying that we said this disingenuously, but I don't think, let's say, that is not the only story. As human beings, like our sentiments can be manipulated, can be changed, and in these. I think when I was a very young, like a teenager in China, thinking about my future careers, and what drew me to particle physics, and in particular to collider particle physics, was its cosmopolitan ideal. At the time, I didn't know much about anything, whether physics or global affairs, but the very idea of an experiment built literally on the border on a war-torn continent as a way to how to help these countries that have been at war for literally centuries to using this instrument of fundamental scientific research as with a rather explicit like peacekeeping mission was something extremely inspiring to me as a Chinese person at the time. And I also believe it's still something that is very inspiring to a lot of our colleagues in particle physics. And so I think this is really it is a matter of shifting the narrative. And what worries me deeply is how right now the dominant narrative, whether it's in an authoritarian society like China's or in the ostensibly liberal democratic one like the US, the dominant narrative is so similar and it's under such a parochial notion. One could arguably say like a bill like the Endless Frontier Act, in arguing for some kind of endless frontier is actually a closing of the moral imagination.
Thanks, Yangyang. I think you were describing CERN when you were talking about the, yes, right, for those who are not paying close attention to that. I know we have a broad audience here. Okay, we have 2 more hands up, so let's see if we can quickly get through. I see SSR 38 next.
Yeah, sorry, I'm Shasta. That's my, I guess going on that note, one of the things you mentioned was sort of the adverse conditions which have existed in the US. And I guess it's bad enough with, world leaders driving wedges between scientists. I was wondering if you had any insight as to, the conduct of scientists themselves, as, and whether, we'll be able to behave in, the egalitarian manner we're expected to, I guess.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think here, like in the course of this talk, I mentioned like different Chinese scientists or Chinese American scientists through course of history in facing very difficult times and also made complicated personal decisions that I think to a lot of degree are debatable with regards to its morality, ethics, and etc. But they are also very understandable with the constraints at the time. And I think this is the kind of thing this is the kind of framework I take to, for example, I mentioned the Committee of 100 report in terms of analyzing the data from the Economic Espionage Act. It has a more recent report that is analyzing the effects of the China Initiative and other forms of scrutiny on international collaborations and its impact on the mentality of US-based scientists. And there were also some feedback that were rather negative towards Chinese scientists, thinking they're all like cheat and steal and lie and this and that. And I think it's deeply uncomfortable for me to read it. But on the other hand, I also see that it's a lot of that is misguided, but it's also not entirely like untrue. There are indeed Chinese scientists or scientists anywhere who may make mistakes or commit a personal misconduct of various reasons. And the real question to ask is that this is not something because like people of Chinese descent are somehow predisposed to making these mistakes. It's about the political system and the social conditions that may have incentivized them to take these kinds of shortcuts because of these government pressures, on the other hand, and also because of the reward systems in a lot of these Chinese universities. And so I think coming back to here in the US as well, like when scientists, on one hand, we say we become scientists because we're driven by curiosity and fascinated by these fundamental questions about nature. That is certainly valid. Like no one will become a scientist if they're not interested about these questions. On the other hand, scientists are also professionals who need to find funding, who need to remain employed and this and that. And when these resources are scarce, and one can argue this is a manufactured scarcity, it doesn't have to be this way. And then and individuals being incentivized by these kinds of scarcities may make different kinds of choices and out of jealousy, out of these different ways to advance their own careers without thinking more about the social cost or the bigger picture.
Great, thank you. Robert, we're at time, but let's see if we can be efficient. Robert.
I'm happy to yield, always yield to the clock if we're
no, if Yangyang has time,
I'm
people
happy
can
to
leave
stay
as
longer.
needed. She has a few more minutes. Go for it, Robert.
Yangyang, always a pleasure, stimulating and enlightening to listen to you. So thank you for the wonderful remarks. You raised the question provocatively of whether states should be drawing lines around knowledge and laying claim to knowledge in a kind of nationalistic sense. And you know, you strongly imply that our answer should be no. But I was wondering if you could maybe say just a word or two more about how absolutist your position is on this. And sort of two just examples came to mind for me. You know, one is this sort of idea that you know, most people, even people in this country who are very strong supporters of the Second Amendment, for example, believe that, you know, ordinary citizens shouldn't be able to have access to nuclear weapons. Right, so there's some line, you know, there's a right to bear arms, but there's some line that we draw, and of course there are all sorts of debates about where to draw the line. The other thing that came to mind for me is that the export control regime for the US, at least, is not strictly identified or characterized in terms of national security. It also identifies other foreign policy interests that are relevant to export control considerations, including human rights considerations. So uses of technology for surveillance or other forms of repression, including, you know, even basic technologies like artificial intelligence and some of the emerging and foundational technologies that you referred to, those broad categories that the Commerce Department has laid out. And I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about whether you think this is, you know, a project that we should all be applying ourselves to, that involves identifying exactly how to calibrate the appropriate degree of openness or protection, or if it really is a kind of abolitionist enterprise that we should be engaged in. And if it's the latter, how do you think about that when there are these other risks out there that perhaps that may be existential or moral that you can't necessarily classify as nationalistic in their character? Thanks.
Thank you so much for the very thoughtful questions. And I should also mention that Rob is my colleague at the law school and executive director of the China Center. And I guess he asked questions fitting with his expertise. And so starting from, so for the first question, it is an interesting one, right? And I think, and it's interesting that you mentioned nuclear weapons. As I know that actually shortly after World War II, there was the Acheson-Lilienthal report. That was when the United States was the only country in the world that had nuclear weapons, and other countries, even the Soviet Union, was still relatively far behind. And that was so there was this question of what should we as in at the time Americans do with this technology, and that the recommendation from that report was basically saying that the United States should open this this knowledge and grant that to an international body to be governed, because the idea was that just like no country, no state can withhold such a line. The border doesn't matter. And I think to an extent that was also in line with what Vannevar Bush said in his report. These are not moralistic claims. These are pragmatic ones that they as scientists understood that if they, with enough prior basic knowledge, because the fundamentals of the science was well established at the time, decades old. So with that basic knowledge, and most important is with enough resources, with funding and with personnel, that any entity, and so because of the amount of resources needed, it's usually that only states, that national governments can provide that kind of resources. But then like any state could conceivably be able to have nuclear weapons. And so it doesn't make any sense for the United States to just holding it as a secret, because that would very quickly not be a secret anymore because others would know it. But by holding it as a secret, it would further incentivize this arms race. It will also have other implications for civil liberties and other societal impacts here in the United States. And the only way to prevent weapons proliferation in the context of nuclear weapons at the time was to grant that to an credible international agency with all sorts of, like, including the source material, guarding the source materials, and also managing this form of knowledge. And so that I always find to be a very, very enlightening report. And of course, it was quickly sidelined with the escalating Cold War, and the world did not become any safer as a result. And everything that was predicted with regards to arms race to weapons proliferation happened. And I think another context coming to your and to your second question, in terms of, as I also mentioned in my talk, right, like export control regimes in the U.S. They're traditionally, like, before this new, like, this emerging and foundational technologies is indeed, like, very much a new thing. But before that, it was about preventing weapons proliferation. A lot of it was preventing, or not necessarily preventing, but curbing human rights abuses, or at least reducing American companies' complicity in these. And some of these are also being placed in the Endless Frontier Act, or other forms of other legislations that are either passed or being debated with regards to putting these on export control bans, or putting some Chinese firms on the entities list so that they cannot purchase source materials from U.S. companies, and cannot sell to U.S. markets, etc. And I think actually Sarah mentioned in her introduction that I wrote about this a bit in my essay for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist last fall for the 75th anniversary issue, that a ban along state lines is, I think such a ban is a step in the right direction, that in terms of reducing U.S. complicity in these human rights abuses. But that is not enough. And what concerns me is that a lot of times the step just stops at drawing a line along national lines. Just from a pragmatic sense, there are always a lot of loopholes, like just in terms of the flow of capital and flow of commerce, that there are a lot of loopholes. So pragmatically, that's not particularly useful. On the other hand, more importantly, these problems are not uniquely Chinese. So just to draw a line along these, a lot of times actually diverts the public attention on a lot of these similar technologies are being used in the US or being used in other countries, developed by ostensible US geopolitical allies. And also, more fundamentally, the question that needs to be asked is not whether or not the US should buy or sell these types of technologies with Chinese companies. The most fundamental question is, why do these types of technologies exist in the first place? How are they being developed? And so this comes back to your earlier question about nuclear weapons, right? All of these questions being asked about how do we control this dangerous thing that scientists created is somewhat after the fact. And when we are looking at these so-called, like, emerging technologies, a lot of these applications are still far on the horizon. So this is where humanity, we as a species, have a choice in terms of deciding the directions of these technologies. And that needs to be based on principles that are not nationalistic or parochial in any sense, but really being able to see all human lives as equally valuable, and seeing this as a shared global responsibility.
All right, I am going to be an awful host and say, Abby, if you can be quick with your question, please go ahead.
Thank you. I will be quick. So Yangyang, I'm a huge fan of all of your public writings. I'm currently a second-year student at the law school and a fellow at the China Center, but I did my undergraduate degree at Purdue in engineering. So like you, I very much, the cosmopolitan ideal of basic research is very appealing. But I just wanted to raise the very common critique that kind of there is no such thing as basic research. this idea that like it's actually impossible in practice to draw these distinctions between what types of research are basic and can benefit from international collaboration versus those which become applied. And there might be more legitimate national security concerns. And so you almost got to this at the very last, the tail end of your answer to Rob's question, but you said that we have a choice as a species, sort of, that we need to make before we reach these applications. And I guess the critique of that would be that whoever invents them first sort of has the choice on how to shape the way that these technologies develop or don't develop or come to market. So are there any sort of technologies that you would acknowledge kind of break this theory that you put forth, where there might be legitimate national security interests in being the first ones to invest in the basic research to develop the technology, to gain sort of the temporal advantage of being able to shape what will ultimately become global norms?
This is a great question, and so actually I'm really glad that you raised this, because in terms of the terminology of basic research, well, it's being used here and there, but like Vannevar Bush was actually in his report, that was one or in a sense a foundational text in terms of his way of defining basic research. And again, like Bush said, he was, of course, he's a scientist and engineer, but also he was a long time like administrator, and so he made this really clever definition that both appeals to scientists as this is curiosity-driven research, but also appeals to politicians and the people who the government who is appealing for funding for that it may yield practical results, and so that's also like his way of defining basic research. And also I mentioned these National Security Directive and NSDD 189, where its term was fundamental research in that it should remain unrestricted. And that was actually a broader term than basic research according to that text. It was, and it stated in the beginning that fundamental research includes both basic research and applied research, as long as it was not explicitly industry-based proprietary research, it's considered fundamental research. And so this is on the terminology side. But I think the more important question that is actually, it's been my position as well, that sometimes I feel with these discussions of like I think the China policy sphere with like civil military fusion or dual use technologies, and a lot of these terminologies on one hand can be illuminating, on the other hand can also be restricting in a way that there are some who may just say, oh, now what I'm working on is not applicable, and it's fundamental research or it's basic research or whatever, and so I can excuse myself or absolve myself from these thorny ethical questions, because very few people, not just scientists, want to think about, oh, would I be complicit in some great harm that not I myself, but someone else who whether it's a state entity or individuals or whatever comes to hold of this knowledge and may use it in some way. It's a very very heavy moral burden to ask. And I think my own answer to this is probably like we should assume that burden more. I know it's because not as, I'm not saying that as a passing moral judgment, but as a way this is a civic duty as living as being part of society, and as a scientist, if we are pushing the frontiers of knowledge, and then we have an obligation to think through the potential consequences of this. That I think I've written about this somewhere as well. That scientists cannot assume to be neutral explorers of nature, but must participate in the effort of moral pathfinding. And so coming to the part of whether there are specific types of technology where there are national security interests, I think actually it's interesting as related to Rob's earlier question about let's say nuclear weapons. The United States, absolutely, like by far, it was the lead ahead of other nations, the Soviet Union by a decade or so, in terms of obtaining this technology. Was it able to shape shape the discourse in any way? Was the country any safer after it in that decade? right, between 45 to the 50s, when Soviet Union came out. In that time, when the United States was the only country in the world that had this technology, and other countries were still very far behind. And then the Soviet Union was the only country that was credibly had just the resources to be able to pursue it. Was the United States any safer? And I think actually now I can like fairly credibly say that it was not. And so and we are still living, and it was not just the United States was not any safer in terms of facing external threats. And I think another very, very important question that is a lot of times being missed was how much the acquisition of nuclear weapons, and it was developed during war. So I think the incentives was rather clear at the time, and I think that is different from the current day that we are not in a global war, and we have a choice and we don't need to go into a global war when the choices become more constrained. But was how much the having nuclear weapons constrained civil liberties in this country, the buildup of the national security regime in this country, the curbing of civil liberties, academic freedoms, and all these secret intelligence agencies and such, they sprang up big, and including the expansion of the president's war powers, and like Congress has not like declared war in the sense after World War II. And the major reason of this was because there is nuclear weapons, so there is this need for speed and then whatever. Right? So the United States became less free because of this terrible, horrible power it gained through this breakthrough in technology. I think Elaine Scarry at Harvard wrote this wonderful book called Thermonuclear Monarchy. That was discussing, right? Was talking about how having weapons of this kind of destructive power was discounting actual United States standing as a liberal democracy. So I think this is another probably more urgent question to talk about when we are just talking about the directions of technology, science and technology development. That this is not about what the Chinese government may or may not do, because that is primarily the responsibility of the Chinese people. But what in the course of hoping to win whatever future imaginary war against China, or whatever form of proxies in terms of an arms race or technological competition or whatever, is what kind of society the United States would become when being driven under this kind of logic.
All right. With that, I will stop the recording.